I'm Greg Stearns, and I make an amazing first impression, obviously. But I've been an elder here at the church, and so just filling in this morning. Last time I spoke was on New Year's Day, and at that time we looked at the question of why are we still here? Kind of the idea of why are we still here on earth? Obviously God still has purposes for us. Why are you still here at this church? God has a purpose for you here at this church if you're still here. And so this morning, I want us to look at a different question of what is the true church? You know, sometimes you hear about people leaving a church and going to a different church, going away from other things. And sometimes, to be honest, I kind of wonder, what's the reason for doing that? And I wonder, you know, is it because we lack a good understanding of what a church is and what it's supposed to be that maybe we give up on the church we're a part of? And so I'm hoping this morning that we can take a look at what did Jesus tell us about what a true church is, what his true church is. What does it mean to be the church? If we don't have a good understanding of that, we're going to miss out on the responsibilities, on the privileges, on the joys of being part of a church. You know, there's a lot, the New Testament, throughout the New Testament, talks about what the church is, but Jesus only mentioned the word church twice in the Gospels. And once he's talking about a sinning brother taken before the church and stuff, and church discipline. And this is really the only time he gives much of a description. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20. If you've got a Bible or a smartphone or a dumb phone or something, or note cards or whatever, go ahead and look that up, or it'll be up on the screen too. On Matthew 16, verses 13 through 20, before we get into reading the passage, I want to give kind of the context of it. This is a time in Jesus' ministry, if we want to bring up the next slide, I think, or even the next one, where Jesus he's already sent out the 12 on their ministry. It's about 10 to 12 months before he's going to be making his final trip to Jerusalem before he's crucified. So he's been in ministry for a couple of years. A few months before this, he sent out the 12. They went out, they came back, he fed the 5,000, and then he fed the 4,000. And then he takes them to Caesarea Philippi, which we're going to read here. Shortly after this, he has a Mount of Transfiguration where Elijah and Moses show up. And then shortly after that, he goes down to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacle and Booths. That's about 6 months before his final Passover. So to give kind of a timeline, we're about a year before the crucifixion. And let's read through the passage in Matthew 16, starting in verse 13. And it says, "Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he was asking his disciples, 'Who do people say that the Son of Man is?' And they said, 'Some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, but others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.' He said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' Simon Peter answered, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.' And Jesus said to him, 'Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven.' Then he warned the disciples that they should tell no one that he was the Christ." So we got a lot going on here. It says he went into the district of Caesarea Philippi. Where is Caesarea Philippi? There's a map. I even got a fancy pointer here. Caesarea Philippi is up here. So it's kind of northeast of Israel. Here's the Sea of Galilee. You've got the Jordan River coming down to the Dead Sea. There's Jerusalem. So he's up here in this area. Caesarea Philippi was a town that was built on the headwaters of the Jordan River. And this is kind of a modern picture of it. But the streams that flow into the Jordan River flowed out from this mountain at Mount Hermon. Herod the Great, remember he was a king who tried to kill Jesus as a baby. Herod the Great had built a temple to Caesar Augustus there in honor of him. Now, Philip the Tetrarch, that was Herod the Great's son, had renamed the town in honor of Caesar, called it Caesarea. You can see Caesar in the name. And Caesarea Philippi, obviously after him being Philip, and to differentiate it from a different Caesarea. Now, Caesarea Philippi was a town that was centered on the worship of the Greek god Pan. Pan was the god that was over shepherds and livestock and that kind of stuff. And you've probably seen pictures of him. If we have on the next slide here, maybe a picture of it. Yeah, that guy, if you know a pan flute, the kind of flutes that move back and forth, that's where it gets its name. That's a pretty evil-looking image. Human on the top, but with the horns, and then he has kind of hooves and stuff for legs. That's what this town was all about, the worship of Pan. So Jesus makes this declaration about where he's going to build his church. Why go to a place like that to do it? Well, we're going to look at that question in a few minutes. But first of all, if we look back at verse 13 of Matthew chapter 16, it says, "Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he was asking his disciples, 'Who do people say that I am?'" And I think the first lesson that we can learn about the church in this is that in Jesus' church, identity is everything. His identity. Churches look a lot about, what's our church identity? What's our corporate identity? What's our name going to be? Our church is looking at possibly changing the name of our church. There's a committee looking at that, and for some of us, that might think, well, how could they ever change the name? And so for some of us, how could think, how could they ever keep the name? And we all have kind of different questions on that. Or a church looks at maybe not its formal identity, but what are we known for? What's our church known for? If you're telling about our church, well, our church is known for this ministry. Our church is known for its wonderful tradition. We've been around here over 100 years. Or our church is known for its innovation. We've got ministries starting up on different areas and on different things, on physical fitness and stuff that other churches don't do. And what's our church identity? Well, Jesus was concerned about the church's identity being him. He's the most important one. He's saying he was asking his disciples, which indicates that it wasn't just a one-time question. It's not just that he brought them before him, okay, we're going to have a class, okay, who do people say the Son of Man is? He didn't just ask it once. He was asking over and over. Now remember, he asked the disciples, what are people saying about the Son of Man? And remember, the disciples had been sent out by him, so they'd been going around in towns and villages. They'd been talking about Jesus and the gospel and the Messiah. They'd been at the feeding of the 5,000, obviously interacting with people. The feeding of the 4,000, they'd had a lot of chances to talk with people about what they thought of Jesus. And what have people been saying? They tell them, well, some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Wow, that's pretty great comparisons. John the Baptist, he was like the guy who had just been martyred for his faith and had led this movement and had these disciples and was baptizing people in the Jordan. Or Elijah? Elijah is like one of the greatest prophets in Israel. He was caught up into heaven on the whirlwind and the chariots of fire and the whole thing. Or Jeremiah, the weeping prophet who was in Jerusalem when the Babylonian exile happened, or one of the other prophets. The disciples are saying, well, some people are comparing you to the best of the best. Anybody see the Super Bowl last week? Probably. Quite a game. I'm not a New England Patriots fan. I'm not a Tom Brady fan. But I've got to admit that they had quite a game last week. If you didn't see it, they were losing, and everybody thought they were done, and they came back, and they won the game in overtime. As I was watching it reminded me of a Super Bowl I watched 15 years ago. And I remember watching Super Bowl 36, and Mindy and I, and Josiah was just a baby, and we were down visiting some friends near Atlanta, Georgia. And it happened to be over Super Bowl weekend, and we were sitting in their family room and watching the game. And in Super Bowl 36, the St. Louis Rams were playing. And their quarterback was Kurt Warner. Kurt Warner that went to UNI and played for the Barnstormers here in town and stuff. And he was a great quarterback. And in that game, the Rams were down, and they came back in the fourth quarter. And they tied it up. The Rams have been in 2 of the last 3 Super Bowls. They were the favorites. They tie it up with like a minute and a half left, a minute and 50 seconds, something like that. It was really just amazing. The other team comes, they kicks the ball off, under 2 minutes left, and it's tied up, and I can see the image in my mind. I'm sitting on the couch and watching this game, and the other team got the ball, and they're moving from right to left on the screen. And the quarterback, and he makes a pass and moves down. Makes another pass and moves down. Hands it off, ball goes down, and he just systematically moves his team down the field, and with 3 seconds left, they get within field goal range, and Vinatieri comes out, kicks a game-winning field goal, no time left on the clock, and they win it. You know who the quarterback was? Tom Brady, in his second year in the league. 15 years ago, he wins a Super Bowl in the last second, leads his team. 15 years later, he leads his team back when they're completely defeated, and he's won Super Bowls in between. I guess I'm not a Tom Brady fan, but I've got to admit, he's got to be one of the greatest quarterbacks to play the game. And really, I think anybody compared with him in the same breath has to take it as a compliment. You know, next year or 5 years from now or 10 years from now, yeah, you know, this guy, he's like Tom Brady when he does this. Or he's like Tom Brady in how he commands his team. You got to take it as a compliment. They're putting him up with the best of the best. That's what the people, the Jews in Jesus' day, were saying about him. Jesus, you're up there with the tops. You're like John the Baptist. You're like Elijah. You're like Jeremiah. Isn't that good enough? No. Because Jesus isn't among the best. He's greater than the best. But the people didn't understand that. It wasn't good enough. And we can see that from a couple different passages. In Matthew chapter 11, verses 2 and 3, people were confused about who he was. Matthew 11, verses 2 and 3, it says, "Now when John, while in prison, heard of the works of Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, 'Are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else?'" John the Baptist was in prison. He'd heard about what Jesus was doing, but his disciples weren't quite sure because Jesus didn't fit their role of the Messiah. The Messiah was going to be the leader that was going to bring the freedom to Israel, political freedom included, freedom from the Romans. He was going to be their political, their general that was going to lead them in rebellion, and that was their image of a Messiah. It's interesting, in the Gospels, Jesus hardly ever refers to himself as Messiah or Christ, even though that's who he was. He uses the term Son of Man dozens of times, because the word was so misconstrued among his audiences that he didn't use it much. Son of Man gave people the idea of humility, humble, servant. And here's John's disciples, and they're saying, okay, are you the Messiah? Because you're not quite fitting our picture of what it should be. And then if we look in John chapter 6, verses 60 and 66, Jesus had been ministering, and in John chapter 6, in verse 60, therefore many of Jesus' disciples, when they heard this, said, "This is a difficult statement. Who can listen to it?" And in verse 66, as a result of this, many of his disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. You know, Jesus wasn't fitting their image of what that Messiah should be. And as a result, they had a misguided concept of Jesus' life and purpose. They didn't get it. And so when they're comparing him to the best of the best, you could say, well, that's nice, but he's over that. He's in a league by himself. In Jesus' church, identity is everything. His identity of who he is. And that's why I believe, why in Matthew 16 and verse 20, how Jesus says, then he warned the disciples that they should tell no one that he was the Christ. And he did that after they came down from the Mount of Transfiguration too. In Matthew 17:9, it says, and they were coming down from the mountain. Jesus commanded them, saying to them, tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. He said, the people aren't getting the fact that I'm the Messiah. Don't try to convince them. Wait until I conquer sin and death. Then go out and do it. And that's, we can see historically what happened in the book of Acts. Nobody got it while Jesus was alive, but afterwards they did, and the church was born. So how about us today? Is Jesus preeminent in all we are and all we do and how we think about ourselves as a church? Do we think about our church in terms of this ministry or this tradition or this innovation or this staff member or these people? Do people know us for that? Or do they know us because, you know, there's something that's like Jesus in these people at First Federated? Is he what we identify with most and what people identify us with most? Or is it something else? Second thing we can learn from this is Jesus' church relies on our personal relationship to him. In verse 15 of Matthew 16, and he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And they said, "John the Baptist," and on. And then in verse 16, Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." In verse 17, and Jesus said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." It's really interesting to me because Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah," or Simon, son of Jonah. Maybe it says in your translation. Bar, in Hebrew, it means son of. Barnabas was son of encouragement. Bar Timaeus was son of Timaeus. Bar mitzvah is son of the commitment or son of the law. It's a time when a Jewish boy in Hebrew tradition becomes legally responsible for his own actions. He's a son of the law. Bar mitzvah. Simon is son of Jonah, Bar Jonah. But Jesus says, it's so interesting. He uses his given name by his earthly parents. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Blessed are you, this person from your earthly parents, because your parents didn't tell you this truth, that I'm the Christ. It's not saying that his parents didn't believe in Jesus, but Jesus is emphasizing, my Father who is in heaven revealed this to you. The most important relationship in Peter's life was his relationship to the Father, not to his earthly parents or to any other person. And that's the same for us. The relationship we have to God is the most important one, and it's the most important one for our church. I'd like us to look at a couple other passages that talk about our relationship to God. In Romans chapter 8, verses 15 and 16, Jesus gives us a different image. In Romans 8, 15 and 16, it says, "For you have not received a spirit of slavery, leading to fear again, but you have received a spirit of adoption as sons, by which we cry out, 'Abba, Father.' The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God." Giving us the image of, by having that personal relationship with God, we're adopted as children, which is truly amazing. In New Testament times, that meant the child had all rights, all privileges, all legal rights that any biological child would have of their parents. Another image is in Ephesians chapter 5. In Ephesians 5, verses 25 to 27, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless." The church is Christ's bride, bought with his own blood. How does he describe it? He gave himself up for her, sanctified, cleansed, in all her glory, no spot or wrinkle, holy, blameless. Guys, we saw that the first video we saw with the older couple and the lady. I mean, if you had a dry eye after that, like I say, your wood's wet. That really tugs at you. And then the weekend to remember, that's great. If you've been married, I wanted you to think about, guys, when you saw your bride for the first time on your wedding day. What was that instance in that ceremony? I remember. By God's blessing and grace, we're celebrating our 20-year anniversary this week. And I remember the moment when we were standing over, it was over in the other sanctuary, big room, worship center, whatever you want to call it, the other place that's part of the other building is where we had our wedding. And I remember standing there and looking down that aisle, and those back doors opened, and light came in, and Mindy was standing there. And I thought, wow, I am blessed beyond what I deserve. I am. That's how Jesus sees us. You want a romantic Valentine's story? Think about a king who goes and rescues the beauty that's been taken captive by the dragon and he won't let her go for anything. And the beauty doesn't respect the king's law or his authority, but the king sets aside his crown and his kingly garments, and he goes and battles a dragon and loses his own life fighting it, but he frees the beauty. And when he comes back to life, he takes her as his bride. That's what Jesus has done for us. That's how he sees us. He sees us as adopted children, as his bride. And that makes all the difference. How do we see our relationship with the Lord? Do we kind of base it on our past spiritual successes? On our what we've known in the past, knowledge we've gained? Or are we keeping that vibrant and fresh with the Lord? And think about the image of the children and the parents. I know with my sons, one of the times I enjoy is when at the end of the day, at night, and they're going to bed, and I go in the room and I just talk to them for a few minutes. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 minutes, sometimes it's 10 or 15, whatever. Just kind of catch up on the day, talk about their dreams, talk about their plans, talk about how they're frustrated with me as a father, whatever. But we talk and we connect. Those are precious times. If I miss those for a couple days, if I miss them for a week or more, there's some distance between us. We need those times to catch up and to stay close. Between a husband and wife. If we're not talking through things, if we're not praying together, there grows that distance and that gap between us. Why would it be any different in our relationship with our Heavenly Father, our Heavenly Husband? If we're not spending time with him, listening to him, listening to what he says, pouring our hearts out to him, why do we think we'd have a vibrant relationship with him? We have to spend time with him. And as we do that, we grow not only personally, but as a church. Because Jesus' church relies on our personal relationship with him. Now, the third lesson we can learn from this is that Jesus' church battles our true enemy. If we look back in Matthew chapter 16, it says they came into the district of Caesarea Philippi. Okay, and that was that town that worshipped that Greek god Pan. And there was a cave in this town. This is obviously a modern picture with people, tourists there and stuff. But the big black one, I feel pretty powerful with one of these. You can kind of point all over the place. Pretty fancy. That's a cave that was known in those days as the gates or the entrance to the netherworld, to the underworld, to hell, to Hades. That was the gates of Hades. That's the place where Jesus said, I'll build my church. Think about for a second with me, where didn't Jesus make this declaration? He didn't make it at the temple in Jerusalem. He didn't make it on a place by the Sea of Galilee when he gave the Sermon on the Mount. He didn't make it at the River Jordan when he was baptizing or John the Baptist was there. He didn't make it at any of those places where his followers gathered and he had the crowds and all the people. He said, no, I'm going to go into the center of paganism where the evil is the strongest. And here, I'm going to build my church. Why? You ever heard the saying, if you want to be strong, pick up something heavy? Who would a great athlete rather compete against? Somebody who's mediocre or somebody who's going to challenge him on the playing field? Somebody's going to challenge him. Jesus is saying, here's the gates of hell, and upon this rock, I'm going to build my church. I'm going to come into your house, and I'm going to set up my kingdom. Jesus is declaring that nothing and nobody is going to stop him or his church. In the hardest place it would be to do that. What is this gates of Hades or gates of hell? Some people look at it as kind of a defensive weapon. You know, we think of the cities in the Old Testament and the New Testament. The cities had city gates where people would come in, and if an attacking army attacked those gates, then it'd be where they defend that. And people say, well, the church needs to be on its offensive and attacking the gates of hell. That could be it. I've seen other scholars that say, well, it's more defensive or an offensive type of thing where the gates of hell would kind of try to surround the church and keep it within its walls. And the church, from its life and its power, is going to burst out of those. And it's going to be that way. I think it could be either of those. But the main point is that that power of hell will not overpower his church. If we look in verse 18 of Matthew 16, it says, "And the gates of Hades will not overpower it." Kataskuo, I don't know if that's how you say it or not. That's the Greek word in the New Testament that overpower is. It's used 2 other times in the New Testament, both of them by Luke. One is in Luke 21:36, where Jesus says, "But keep on the alert at all times, praying that you may have strength, praying that you may have kataskuo, to escape all these things that are about to take place and to stand before the Son of Man." It's the idea of strength and power and resistance, that kataskuo. The other instance is also in Luke. If we can bring up that in Luke 23:23, it says, and this is about when Jesus is being on trial, and it says, "But they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail," or kataskuo. That kataskuo, that strength, that power, is imposing your will on someone else, prevailing, overpowering, being strong. Jesus says, the gates of hell will not overpower, will not kataskuo my church. He's made us strong, and he's given us the weapons to fight against those powers of evil. And in 2 Corinthians 10, verses 4 and 5, Paul elaborates a little bit on this. He says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ." He's saying the weapons of our warfare are not about swords and shields and guns and knives and weapons. It's spiritual, and it's about destroying those spiritual fortresses. So, what does it take to prevail in our battle against the powers of hell? First, understand who Jesus is. In Jesus' church, identity is everything. His identity. Secondly, flourish and grow in our relationship with God. Because Jesus' church relies on our personal relationship with him. And then run to the battle, not from it. Because Jesus' church battles our true enemy. Who is our true enemy? It's not the person sitting next to you. It's not the person worshiping at the church down the street, or across town, or across the world. We're not each other's enemies. I might not agree with you on everything about what goes on here. Probably not. We're going to have differences. We're going to have different gifts, different opinions. But we're not each other's enemies. Neither are the people that Jesus wants to save our enemies. Our enemies are the powers of hell, the destructive forces at work in the world. So, there was a man named Charles T. Studd, C.T. Studd, who lived late 1860s or late 1800s, early 1900s. He went to Cambridge, and he was a missionary to China with Hudson Taylor. While he was at Cambridge, he played on England's cricket team. You know, cricket that's kind of like baseball, but not really, that they play over there. He was on the national team, and he was very good at it. But he felt God's calling on his life to be a missionary. He came from a very wealthy family. And while he was a missionary in China, his father passed away and left him an inheritance that in today's dollars would be worth over $1 million, at least. I did some of those online calculators. Some of them put up $4 million. I'm not sure how it all works. But anyway, a lot of money. And he said, no, the Lord's going to supply my needs. And he donated all of it. It's about 4 or 5 different ministries. He gave it all away. And he had some different quotes and famous quotes. But one of them we'll bring up. He said, "Someone lived within the sound of church and a chapel bell. I want to rent a rescue shop within a yard of hell." He said, some people want to live where it's easy and it's comfortable and everybody likes me and it's not going to be too bad. He wanted to run a rescue shop. Let's not miss that. He wants to rescue the perishing. He wants to rescue those that are headed there just outside hell's gates and say, no, we're going to stand here. And this is where the church will not be overpowered. Where are you today? What's your understanding of the church? What is it about our church? Is our church all about programs and ministries and staff and history and innovations and future and buildings and stuff? Or is it about Jesus? And where are those gates of Hades for our church, for our community, for our families that are trying to suck in the people around us? And will we go there and let God be powerful through us to rescue those people that need it? We're all sinners saved by grace. Let's let God use us to bring more along. If the band wants to come up, we're going to sing one more time. Let's close in prayer. Our Lord Jesus, I thank you for giving us the opportunity this morning to open your word. And I pray that you would use your word in our lives. God, you have called us your church. You have bought us with your blood. You have adopted us. You've taken us as your bride. And we don't deserve any of it. But Lord, the powers of hell are just as real today as they were when you made this statement. God, I pray that you would bring yourself glory by using us to do your good work in our community today and this week and going forward. I pray that your Spirit would have your way in our hearts this week. And we love you, Lord, and we ask this in your name. Amen.